Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. My name is Muhi Khwaja with American Muslim Community Foundation. Today on the Muslim Philanthropy podcast, we are pleased to have on Phil Buchanan, who is the president at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. Welcome to the show, Phil.
Thanks, Muhi. Great to be here.
Yeah, so we've had an opportunity to meet in the past when you were visiting the San Francisco Bay Area at the Silicon Valley Venture Fund. And were listening to you talk about your book, Giving Done Right. So thank you for being a guest on the show.
Yeah, it's an honor. I'm glad to be here with you.
Likewise. So for those that don't know you, can you please share a little bit more about your background and where you grew up or went to school and anything else that you'd like to share?
Sure. Yeah, I was born in Toronto, Canada. My family moved to Oregon when I was about 6 months old, and so I grew up mostly entirely in Portland, Oregon, really, and really never was sure what I wanted to do. Definitely didn't think I would end up in philanthropy, but I think, quite influenced by my dad, who was quite an activist and was, in ways that I admired, although in ways sometimes I questioned, the wisdom of lying on train tracks that took the nuclear warheads up to Washington State and getting arrested, or
Wow.
earlier, before I was born, he had been arrested in a civil rights protest at a lunch counter in North Carolina, and so I admired his sort of dedication to try to make some kind of positive difference in the world. And I think for a long time I thought I would do that through journalism. That was my focus. Uh, I went to college at Wesleyan in Connecticut and was the nerdy person who was like the editor of the student newspaper, and then went back to work at Wesleyan. I went away for a little while, went back to work as the assistant to the president there. Um, then ended up working for an interim president who became president of Mount Holyoke College. So I was the 25-year-old guy who was the assistant to the president of the oldest women's college in the country, and it's a really interesting experience. She was an incredible mentor to me. I learned a lot about leadership from her, and then I still was not clear that I was getting to my late 20s. Like, what am I doing career wise? Because this is a fun job, but it's not really leading anywhere. And so I went to business school. And then I worked in strategy consulting in the corporate world for a little while. And I think uh, I learned a lot, but I was always thinking of my dad, who had died when I was 14, and I thought, okay, my dad would not approve of this career choice, as I was, trying to help companies increase their profitability in various ways. Not that he would have thought, Phil, you could do more, you could do something that has a little more purpose. And positive, influence on the world. And so anyway, I ended up as the first staff member hired by a sort of dysfunctional founding board of CEP, when there was a very little bit of money raised and a kind of vague idea of what the organization might do.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing your journey to CEP. And what would you say in those experiences kind of prepared you for CEP?
Well, one of the things about higher ed was, it's a enterprise that cannot be evaluated, in the way that you evaluate a company, right? You can look at the financial statements, and that doesn't really tell you what you really want to know. So I was very interested in this question of, how do you assess the performance of mission-driven institutions whose um, ultimate impact really cannot be summarized by a single number, right? It's way more complicated than that. And and institutions with lots of resources and potential. Um, and so that higher ed experience definitely, I think, prepared me for the idea that, working with foundations, we would try to help them think about, well, how are they doing and how could they do better? And there were lots of analogies, for me, like one of the early things we did at CEP was create the grantee perception report, which is this large scale confidential comparative survey of nonprofits about their experiences with foundations. And the analogy to me was sort of to student surveys in the college world in the following way,
Sure.
which is that on an absolute basis, as cynical as nonprofits might be about foundations, on an absolute basis, they rate the foundations that are funding them highly, right? Because they're the foundations that are funding them. And the data only gets really interesting when you look at it on a comparative basis. And it was the exact same thing with student survey data in colleges. Like people like college, in general. Uh, but then how do the experiences of students at a particular college compare on various dimensions to another college? That's where it starts to get really meaningful and interesting. And then you can mine that data for insight. So there were lots of analogies there. So I think that was one way, and then I guess the other thing that I really took in particular, I respect and admire both the college presidents that I worked for, but I worked much longer for a woman named Joanne Crichton, who had been the vice president for academic affairs and then interim president at Wesleyan and then president of Mount Holyoke. And one of the things I admired about her leadership is that she was brutally candid, just open and transparent, in her time at Mount Holyoke, where she walked into some real issues, and just kind of put it out there and said, like, we're going to engage this as a community. We're not going to spin anything. And I saw the power of of trust when you can really have trust in that way, as a leader, and the way in which that can mobilize people to work together, to confront shared problems rather than always thinking of, well, the leadership is sort of separate and not to be trusted. And so that's something I took from her just as a mentor, and that I'm sure I have imperfectly exemplified that as a leader of a much obviously smaller organization. But I've really tried to hold on to that and try to influence foundation leaders in that way as well.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a great point about, mentorship and kind of having those people in your career that help show you, whether it's literally like guiding you or through their example, right, of how
Right.
they deal with things and being a close observer of that. So thank you for sharing about her and how it has transformed your leadership as well. Um, in terms of CEP, what are the main programs and services that you guys currently offer? And
Yeah.
definitely, it's been great to hear that you guys had done those surveys for the grantees and kind of like, how is that first one of those early projects, led to so many other projects at CEP?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what happened is we realized, boy, there is real power in elevating the perspective of those who can't really be totally honest with those they fund, right? Because of the power dynamic between the funder and those who are seeking funding. So the grantee perception report has become, something that hundreds of foundations have used as a way to really understand the experience of grantees, and it's allowed us to compare um, across foundations and also mine that large comparative data set for insights about what makes for a strong relationship between a nonprofit and a funder. What are nonprofits really looking for? What do they most value from their foundation funders? And so we've created various other analogous tools. We have a comparative donor survey for community foundations, for example. We have a declined applicant survey. We do a lot of more custom advisory work with foundations and donors that really play into our capabilities in survey design, in data analysis. But then we have a whole research agenda of grant funded research that taps some of those data sets, but also we create other data sets through both qualitative interviews, surveys, to do things like benchmark, how has philanthropy responded to the crises of 2020? We have 3 reports on our website about foundations in particular. Have they changed their practices? Have they changed who's funded? Are they supporting more communities of color? Are they supporting more organizations led by people of color? And we're able to track those kinds of issues and questions. We have other research on how nonprofits are experiencing this time of crisis, or issues related to questions of foundations and their influence on policy, or how individual donors might best interact and build relationships with foundations. So there's a whole research component. And then we have all of the programming and external relations. We do events, webinars. We have a podcast, which is very creatively also called Giving Done Right, that we launched last fall. My colleague Grace Nicolette and I co-host that podcast, and that's really aimed at individual donors in particular. Those are the main programs of CEP. We also have an initiative that sits within CEP, which is a little different, and it's sort of separately branded, called Youth Truth. It's youthtruthsurvey.org. And I'll spare you the long origin story there, but it's a student survey aimed at informing education funders, as well as school districts and charter management organizations, about the experience of young people in schools, both academically and in terms of the overall climate. And that's been a really fun project and really important in this period of isolation for so many young people.
Yeah, the data-centric focus is really critical. And, AMCF started in 2016 with like a strategic plan and an idea of a minimum viable product being donor advised funds.
Yep.
I would say that we knew the concept, but we necessarily didn't know what we were getting into in terms of like the ins and outs and all of the intricacies. And, people have their opinions on donor advised funds, whether they're a tool for the
Right.
wealthy. And
Right.
we really wanted to flip the script, right? We brought the minimums down to 2,500 to open a DAF.
Yeah.
We hadn't even invested donor advised fund dollars until 2021. And we did that purposely because we wanted to get money out the door. We told the
Yeah.
donors, you're joining our community foundation because you want to make a direct impact, and we need to do that fast. And we've been able to give out $3.5 million since 2017, only working with 108 families now. So, we're interested to see how our data looks over the last 4 years, and are partnering with Giving USA and DAF RC to share our data sets, to kind of
It's
further
awesome.
go into, are people funding religious uh, houses of worship, mosques, or international relief agencies, or educational institutions, and all of that great stuff that Giving USA looks into. So we're really excited to see kind of what comes from it. And, I think it's so important in telling the story. And that's why our podcast and everything that we do is hashtagged Muslim philanthropy, because we want to be telling that story of how Muslims are giving not only to Muslim led or Muslim focused institutions, but overall all nonprofit organizations. And there's some data from the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, ISPU, that did in a report on American Muslim philanthropy that showcases that Muslims are just as likely to give to causes outside of our faith-based community than we are within our faith-based community.
Yeah. I mean, that's so important. There's so much in what you just said. I feel like that um, brings up thoughts for me about, um, first of all, I was in a conversation recently and somebody said something that, really kind of um, set me back a little bit, which was to sort of describe data as almost like a tool of the man, and
Mm,
I'm like, well, actually, I suppose it can be. Anything can be a tool of the man, right? But actually, it is data that allows us to understand inequity, right? It's data that allows us to see that the criminal justice system doesn't treat, people fairly, or incarcerate people at the same rates, or it is data that allows us
Right.
to see, school discipline is racist, right? And it is data that allows you to see um, the the scale, scope, and diversity of Muslim philanthropy, right? And so, like, data can be a force for progress and equity, and it's so important that we think of it that way. And then the other thing that I am a little puzzled by, that has increasingly been described as a tool of the man, is philanthropy, right? And
Right.
again, like anything, right? I suppose um, that can be true, and sometimes is true. Um, but also it can be a tool for empowerment and mobilization. And you think about the period we've just experienced in this country. um, some of the folks who make that argument sort of idealize government, right? Say, well, it is government that we should rely on to do this or that or the other, and not philanthropy. But it was government that was targeting explicitly Muslim people, right? So
Yeah.
who's there to fight against that?
And
It
and
is
what's
nonprofit organizations supported by philanthropy.
yeah.
So it's really important that we remember that, how vital that is, right? To have that countervailing force to say, no, this is wrong, and to fight against it. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and it's funny because there's even a movement within the government to also fund surveillance of Muslim and minority communities, and they give it out in the form of grants to nonprofits to do work,
Right.
and they call it countering violence extremism, CVE.
Right.
So, there's a whole other issue of then Muslim-led institutions accepting this money to then go back to the government and say, we checked all the boxes. We talked
Yeah.
about how extremism is bad, and there's all strings attached to that funding as well. So I see it on both sides, and for philanthropy, we want to be showcasing the benefits of it to society. Melinda Gates is often quoted saying that philanthropy is where the lack of government funding kind of steps in, right?
Right.
And then there's also an initiative called Philanthropy Together, where they promote giving circles and everything. And they often talk about demystifying, democratizing, and decolonizing philanthropy.
Yeah.
So again, this whole idea of education on philanthropy and the impact that it can have. Let's focus on the good that it does, and it's not something just for the rich and wealthy, but it's something that everybody does, whether they're have the capacity and means to, or they're doing it through their time, talent, and treasure. What is that measurement of philanthropy? And it's beyond dollars, right? So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, and also the history, right? Like, and the history in Muslim society, right? Going
Hmm.
back to the 8th century and walks, if I'm saying that word right.
Yes. Yeah.
And, institutions intended to look after communities for the long haul. And
Totally.
the relationship between that idea and that
Hmm.
incredibly long history, right? And other forms of institutions intended to better communities for the long haul, like American foundations. Like, there's so much interesting tradition and history there that's rooted, I think, in this human, desire, and you can kind of inclination, and you can find it in Muslim society, you can find it in other religious traditions, to care for others and to care for
Of
community.
course.
and
Yeah.
and like, this is something that, even as we are clear-eyed about the way things can be misused, we need to um, I think, encourage and celebrate as one of the best parts of, like, the human instinct. So I just think there's I I'm worried, as you can tell, that we don't um, celebrate enough and encourage enough that instinct in people.
Yeah, and I think, I appreciate you bringing up the idea of waqfs, and essentially it's an Arabic word that translates to endowments, right? So these
Right,
were
right,
people who, through their wills and estates, were encouraged to leave their wealth to establish things, and whether it was land that was specifically used for the crops to then benefit the community, or say a well to then give water to the entire, different tribes in the area instead of just one tribe. Or there's examples of women who inherited funds that then established Qarawiyyin University, which is credited as the oldest university in the world, which is in Morocco. So
yeah,
there's clear examples through history of Muslim philanthropists who use these endowments and wills to really um, care for society. And if you look at the Greek definition of philanthropy, the love of mankind, really
yeah,
that's what it's all about, right?
right.
So I appreciate you bringing that up as well. I would love to for you to talk more about not only your podcast, but mainly your book, Giving Done Right.
Yeah, yeah.
So why did you want to write Giving Done Right?
All right, part of it goes to what I just said, which is like I think that there's an underappreciation, at least in this country, which is what I know best in terms of you know uh, philanthropy, an underappreciation of the role that philanthropy and the nonprofit sector has played and can play that is distinct from business and government. I just don't think we've societally like held that up enough, appreciated it enough. And in fact, there's a lot of sort of um, negative stereotypes and kind of instinctive dissing of nonprofits that goes on that I wanted to counter by saying, actually, and certainly we've seen this in the last year post COVID, the heroism of organizations serving communities that have been disproportionately hard hit by both the pandemic and the economic impacts. The way that they have had to pivot their operations, just capturing in the
Yeah,
book that spirit so that donors would then approach the enterprise of giving with the humility and respect for the people on the other end that is required to be effective, I think. And so I wanted to inspire people with those stories as well as practical advice, but also to, and who knows whether a book can really have an effect on people, but stop people from making the predictable mistakes that so many donors make, which is like the flip side of what I was just talking about, which is believing, because they made a lot of money in business, all they have to do is, use their business acumen, to disrupt poverty as if that's going to be as easy as, Uber disrupting the taxi industry. Not that that was easy, but it's a heck of a lot easier. Underestimating the distinct challenges of this work, the way strategy is different when the dynamics are collaborative rather than competitive, because your strategy actually has to be shared across entities, unlike in business where it has to be distinct and different and closely guarded, or the ways performance measurement are different, which I alluded to before, when the ultimate impact cannot be boiled down to something like profit or appreciation of an equity valuation. So how do you approach performance assessment then in a thoughtful way to get better? How do you not make the mistakes that so many donors make when they look for the analog to profit and they focus on silly metrics like overhead ratios that don't really tell you anything and that can actually
right.
undermine a nonprofit's efficacy. So it was really that. It was like frustration with the predictable mistakes and my desire to try to do something that would reduce the chances that those mistakes get repeated, but also inspiration about what good can be done. And those same kind of animating motivations are behind the podcast as well, where we're just trying to bring people on to help donors understand yeah, how hard it is actually to be effective in your giving, and what are some of the ways that you can maximize the chances that you will be.
Yeah, I think, in the method of like celebrating giving, right? AMCF in 2020 established our Muslim Philanthropy Awards to really recognize everyone from philanthropists to volunteer fundraisers to businesses doing a good job of giving back, to nonprofit organizations that are should be recognized. So we really wanted to play a role in that celebration of
That's
charitable
great.
giving, and
Love
it's
that.
something that we hope to continue to do. In regards to the book and the podcast, I highly recommend everybody check it out. Giving Done Right, and I've had the pleasure of reading through your book, and we even auctioned it off at our annual symposium, and it did go for sale, and somebody bought it, so don't worry.
I'm
uh,
not even going to ask for how much. It's just $4.
no, no. We started it at about maybe 20 and it ended up going for 80. So,
Oh yeah, all
yeah,
right.
totally. It worked. And we really appreciate your voice in telling this story. And um, I think that it's incredibly important for not only nonprofit leaders, but just like you're saying, people who are giving to really understand how they can be more effective with their charitable giving. And we hope that donor advised funds are part of that story. And if we can kind of
Right,
rebrand what DAFs do,
right.
and how they're used and flip the script on getting more money out to the community,
Yeah,
I think that the overall impact can be increased. Um, so
that's
along
great.
those lines of like getting funding out the door,
Yeah.
what can mainstream philanthropy do to give more effectively in supporting marginalized and minority-led community organizations?
Yeah, there's so much. I mean, I don't even know where to start. I mean, one thing is get over the sort of um, fetishization, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, of
Sure.
scale, right?
Hmm.
Like, which is another thing that comes out of the business world. So it is true that sometimes the right thing is for organizations to grow and go to different geographies, but often the most effective thing actually is to support organizations that are small and rooted in community. Why? Because they're trusted by those communities, right? So part of what we have to do is just break out of some of these mindsets that we have. Like I wrote on our blog cep.org a little bit about um, an organization called World Relief Seattle and what they faced in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. So, this is an organization
Hmm.
that works with immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, helps them get their feet on the ground in their new country, helps them get employment, provides a variety of other services. When the pandemic hit, um, many of their former clients were working in the hospitality industry and were immediately unemployed. They could not feed their families. So where did they go? Well, they went not to the food bank. They went to World Relief Seattle. Why? Because they trusted the people there who looked like them, who had stories like theirs, and they knew that they would be safe going there. So what does World Relief Seattle do? They have to, suddenly become a food bank. They partnered with the big food bank and deliver food for a while until things were sorted out. And um, the point there is that organization's effectiveness in meeting the needs of that community was about it being in that community. And so smallness was
Right.
an asset, right?
Hmm.
So I think that's part of it. Another piece is recognizing um, the role of inequity, structural racism, uh, in almost everything. So you can read. So you asked, what can mainstream philanthropy do? Like, you can read, this is maybe a little less true now than it was a year ago, 2 or 3 years ago, but you could go and read the strategy statements of foundations working on an issue like education or the environment, and they won't even mention issues of race and racism, right?
Sure.
Well,
Yeah.
but how can you work on environment environmental issues in the United States and not take into account the degree to which people of color have been disproportionately, impacted by exposure to toxins? How can you work on education and not take into account the structures of racism that have led to disproportionate poverty? That means people come in, with different um, advantages or disadvantages, or not engage the school discipline differences, right? So recognizing that these questions um, of marginalized uh, groups, you know, this is not its own program area. This is every program area, right? You that to think about it that way, and then very practically. Um, and again, I'm not sure exactly what you mean when you say mainstream philanthropy, but I think of, you know, I think of foundations, but also individual donors, understanding, like, and asking the question, like, who are we supporting? Like,
Right.
is this organization, what does its board look like? Uh, what does its leadership look like? How many times, and this gets a little tricky, because I do not want to be heard as saying, you know, only people from a community can do work that benefits a community.
Sure.
Uh, that's too simplistic, and I think that's not the message I want to send. But we need to be more skeptical, because there have been so many examples of solutions that come from outside, air quotes, a community, that are imposed on a community without an understanding of what that community actually wants and needs. And I tell lots of
Hmm.
stories of that in the book,
Yeah.
including, um, you know, Bill and Melinda Gates, who have done lots of good things, but deciding that what poor people in developing countries really needed to do was raise chickens, and launch this big initiative. And Bill Gates wrote on his blog, "If I were poor, that's what I would do. I would raise chickens." And the government of Bolivia said, "We don't want your chickens." Like, and the lack of connection to the people who you are seeking to help, to understand whether, however much sense it might make when the McKinsey consultant or whoever draws it up, if it's not what people want for their own lives, they should have some voice in that. And I think that's the same mistake that played out in the Newark public schools with Mark Zuckerberg's initiative,
Sure.
so many other examples. So we have got to recognize and trust the leadership that exists within these communities, and support that leadership, rather than coming into these donor nonprofit relationships and transactions with the going in assumption that the nonprofit doesn't know what they're doing, or nonprofits are ineffective, or I know more than they do, which is how so much philanthropy, too much philanthropy, happens, with this kind of distrust and disrespect of the valuable knowledge that nonprofit leaders in community have.
Yeah, and even to the Gates Foundation, right? They try to champion local partners, right? So where the disconnect came from, that's interesting to see, and maybe more telling to kind of further look into. But at the same time, it's hard to argue against some of the overall impact that they've seen. But it's good to always have that critical eye in terms of how they develop and what they do, and how it's implemented. So I think it's
Yeah,
fair.
and
Yeah.
let me say, I mean, like, on the global health area, and there's lots of criticisms of them, but I believe that they have contributed to, massive decreases in childhood mortality, right?
Right. Right.
In meaningful ways. So there's lots of good stuff that the Gates Foundation has done. What's true of most big donors, and most big foundations, and it's certainly true of the Gates Foundation, is they are simultaneously an example of giving done right and giving done wrong. You know, and and they, because I could point to areas where I think that they've done fabulous work,
Right.
and then areas, including U.S. public education, where the number of missteps that I think could have been avoided with a little more
Yeah.
humility and engagement of different constituents is, you know, really not great. You know, so I think both things are true.
Maybe that's a title for an upcoming book, Giving Done Wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
So to one of our colleagues' points, Maggie Osborne, who's also been on the podcast,
yeah, she's great.
um, she talks about how these policies that we draft and even in the MOUs of our documents that the vision doesn't come through to that level, right? It's a
Right.
very contractual
Totally.
agreement between a donor and an organization or a foundation and a nonprofit. But if they really had these visions and goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion and getting funding to the right places and building community, why isn't that in the MOU? And that's something that AMCF, when we heard that, we're like, okay, we got to revise it. Like we just did the
Right.
cookie cutter
Right.
type of thing. But hopefully now going forward, our new contracts, whether it's for fiscal sponsorship or endowments or giving circles and donor advised funds, we want to revise those to really have our end goal talk about the communal effect of charitable giving together and how we can hopefully change the perception of Muslims in this country through our charitable giving.
Yeah.
And talk about how we need allies to do that beyond the Muslim community itself. And I really hope that this is an opportunity for mainstream philanthropy to kind of create a joint fund, whether it's like the Borealis or Change Philanthropy or so many other examples where they've come around marginalized communities and funded for several years different initiatives. And I think it's about time that we invite community foundations and other philanthropists to do the same thing for Muslim-led and Muslim-focused institutions in this country as well.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I think, I mean, one of the things that um, is true is that the really good donors will recognize when they're so distant from something that they care about, that they need to trust others to allocate their resources, right? You
Right.
know, so and there's an instinctive worry about doing that because additional transaction costs and, you know, all that kind of thing. But I think on so many different issues, the right thing sometimes can be to say, hey, we're not experts in this, but we want to be part of a pooled fund or a shared effort that is
Exactly.
steered by folks who really get it, and we will trust them to allocate those resources.
Yeah, so that's definitely an initiative over the next year or so that I'm committed to hopefully seeing. And, I think the opportunity is there. And I think
Yeah.
it's about time that we get there as well.
Awesome.
So, I've really enjoyed chatting with you and just a few more questions before we close out. Beyond all of the philanthropy talk, beyond work, what else is keeping you busy these days?
Yeah. Um, Trying to teach my 16-year-old how to drive.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And remaining calm while doing so. And then spending, like a lot of people in the relatively early days of, quarantine, uh, we got a puppy. So I spend
Nice.
uh, a lot of time with her, just like walking in the woods near where we live. So, and then also, like a lot of people, probably uh, too much, Netflix binge watching. But trying to read also, and read less nonfiction. I read too much nonfiction and trying to
Hmm.
force myself to read more fiction.
Nice. For the driving, like I feel like that's definitely one of those rites of passages of like as a teenager, that was like one of the things I was looking forward to the most. And I got my start in a ratty old 1988 Honda Accord. So I think my dad paid like less than $800 for it. It was like,
Right. Right. I remember what those ones look like, those
yeah,
80s Honda Accords. Yeah,
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 with the
yeah,
flip up headlights and everything.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, so Uh, my favorite question, asking all of the people who attend the podcast, is what are your three favorite charities?
That's a very, like I get in a lot of trouble. I will say, I will answer it in the following way. Three of my favorite organizations.
Fair enough.
One organization that I just think is phenomenal is Equal Justice Initiative, led by Brian Stevenson, and I
Definitely.
think most people know about them. But
Yeah.
I think one of the cool things about EJI and Brian is that they have simultaneously dealt with as everybody knows, if you've read Just Mercy or watched the movie, both of which I highly recommend, he advocated on behalf of individual people, right, who had been unjustly, um, imprisoned, but also shows how an organization can work on that level of the problem while also seeking to address kind of the root cause issues through criminal justice reform, but even deeper than that, through an examination of our history of racism and of dehumanizing, um, you know, Black people and other people of color in this country, reckoning with that history. Like all of these things are linked, and their ability to work at all those different levels, I think, is amazing.
Yeah.
Two other, I like the organizations I wrote about in the book, and I was able to get to know them. So, like, I wrote about this organization called Epiphany Community uh, uh, Echoes, Epiphany Community Health Outreach Services in Houston, Texas, which is like in a way, it's like your typical community health organization serving very impoverished people, $500,000 budget, and amazing executive director and amazing staff who do so much to serve people who desperately need help. And I love them in part because they're both exceptional, and organizations like that and people like that are in every community, and so they're awesome. um, and I don't know, another organization that I write about in the book, which I think is great, is called Bell Excel, which works on the issue of summer learning loss for low income kids, which
Hmm.
is basically the academic backsliding occurs for all kids in the summer, but it's more pronounced for kids
Sure.
from low income backgrounds. And anything we can do in this country to try to close this gap of just opportunity, and it's so incredibly wide. And the woman who ran it at the time that I wrote the book is named Tiffany Cooper Guy, who's one of the nonprofit leaders I admire the most, and she's now at Blue Meridian, which is a
Oh
funder
yeah. Yeah.
collaborative, and
Hmm.
she's about to become our board chair actually at CEP. So
Nice.
that's another organization that I really admire. But I could go on and on. There's so many.
That's really great. And I appreciate you bringing each of those up because they also serve a different area of need within this country.
Right.
And I had the opportunity to listen to Brian Stevenson keynote at the Association of Fundraising Professionals conference and was just blown away and inspired and
Right.
just energized by the work that he does. So I'll definitely look into the other two organizations as well and learn more about them. And we have a nonprofit directory on our website that allows people to kind of learn about these different types of organizations. And essentially, the donor advised funds and giving circles can give to those nonprofits. And, we're trying to do what we can to bring more exposure to these organizations by inviting them on this podcast and sharing our best practices, leadership development, capacity building webinars with them as well. So if you're a nonprofit that's not on our directory, check out our website and fill out the eligibility form. So, Phil, is there anything else that you'd like to share that we maybe didn't cover?
No, I do want to say that, yeah, I really admire what you're doing,
Oh, thank you.
Muhi, and I appreciate your take on donor advised funds. Like whatever one thinks about, you know, how they should be regulated differently or
Hmm.
not, or whatever. It is the case that they can be a vehicle for everyday givers
Totally.
to give more easily, and so yeah, just appreciate what you're doing and appreciate being able to spend this time with you. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, of course. Likewise, keep up the great work at CEP and excited to see and follow some of that data and hopefully even get some of our data to you as well so that we can help tell the story more. So, Phil, I really appreciate your time. This was an enlightening conversation, and I'm looking forward to um, being a colleague of yours continued. So, thank you so much for
For
being on
sure.
the show.
Thank you again for having me.
Definitely.